Hi, my name is Kai Gittens. Welcome to this screencast tutorial on JavaScript for loops. This is definitely a tutorial for the JavaScript beginner. I'm about to talk about the JavaScript for loop in painfully excruciating detail, and I'm also going to talk about some basics like how to create a variable in JavaScript and what an if-else statement is. So if you're old school JavaScript person, then you're about to be bored by what you're about to see. But if you're a new school JavaScript person, then this tutorial is definitely for you. So what is a JavaScript for loop? Well, for loops as a whole exist in many other programming languages. But when you talk about the JavaScript for loop, you're talking about code that works inside of a web page. There are definitely things like Node.js which are moving JavaScript as a whole to the server side of things. But right now, 99 times out of 100, when you talk about JavaScript as a whole, you're talking about code that works on the client side inside a web page. And in that context, a JavaScript for loop is a block of code that acts like a souped up counter. And this counter helps you automate some processes. There is a principle called dry in computer programming, DRY, don't repeat yourself, which says if there's a piece of code that you have to run or execute or create more than once, don't write out that code by hand. Find a way to automatically create that code. The for loop assists in that. And I'm going to flesh all of this out as we go through this tutorial. But just know that a JavaScript for loop is a code block that helps you automate processes inside your overall code. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. What we're going to do is we've got these four highlighted divs here. We are going to use a for loop to automatically create some jQuery code to apply to each of these divs. The code is going to fade in and fade out these elements in and out of one another. It's going to be really cool. Let's talk about these divs here for a second. So each div contains some unique content, as you see here. Also, each div has a unique page ID name, LM0, LM1, LM2, LM3. LM in this case is short for element. As far as why I started counting at 0 instead of 1, you'll see why I did that when I started to create the for loop. Also, each page element is sharing the to-be-faded class name right here. And to-be-faded refers to some very simple CSS right here. So basically, any page element with a to-be-faded class is going to be set to display none. So it's going to load on the web page, but it's not going to be visible on the web page until our code tells it to be visible. Each of the to-be-faded class elements are set to position absolute. So in the context of how I wrote the HTML, these page elements are going to load on the top left-hand corner of the page, and they're going to also be stacked on top of one another like a deck of cards. No meaning at all with this font size 70 point here. I just made the content big, so hopefully you won't have to full screen the video. I hope so. And let's also talk about the JavaScript references. So here I am referring to the core jQuery library, which is at version 1.7.1 at the time of this recording. Also, I've got this fadecode.js reference here. Fadecode.js is where we're going to put our for loop code. Now, as I just said, we're not going to hand write out this jQuery that's going to fade all these elements in and out of one another. A for loop is going to dynamically create the code for us. But just for reference, let's look at what the code would look like if I had actually written it out by hand. So here I've got a bunch of code wrapped inside of a self-executing jQuery function or self-invoking jQuery function, whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to uncomment each of these lines here. It'll help you better understand exactly what we're doing. So the first uncommented line I have here, it's jQuery targeting the LM0 page element right here. Let me load the file up completely. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, so it's targeting LM0, and then jQuery is going to fade it in 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. It's then going to delay it in 2,000 milliseconds or 2 seconds, and then it's going to fade it out in 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. I'm just going to talk in milliseconds from here on in for the most part, by the way. I'm assuming you understand the conversion at this point. So yeah, LM0 should fade in, delay, and fade out when it runs inside of a browser. Let's see if that's exactly what happens. Perfect. Our code did exactly what we wanted it to do. And let's uncomment the next line. So basically, now I am targeting the LM1 element right here. And basically what I want to happen is as LM0 fades out, I want LM1 to fade in. And you would think maybe if you're first learning JavaScript or jQuery, you might think, hey, I'll just write my code in sequence and things will just automatically work perfectly. But let's see when we do that. Yeah, LM0 should fade out as LM1 is fading in. That's not what's happening. They're both fading in, delaying, and fading out at the same time. So we have to apply a hack to LM1 to make sure it doesn't fade in until LM0 fades out. Well, the hack's pretty easy to figure out. Basically, LM0 is fading in 1,000 milliseconds, and then it's delaying in 2,000 milliseconds. So in other words, it takes 3,000 milliseconds of time for LM0 to hit its fade out. And since we wanted to hit its fade out at the exact same time as LM1 hits its fade in, we can just do this little hack here and apply a delay of 3,000 milliseconds to LM1, and things should be neatly synced up. Let's see if that's what's happening. Well, they're not fading in at the same time. That's good. Okay, great. Yeah, our code is doing exactly what we're telling it to do. Well, this delay, it works. It's a bit of a pain, but it works. And if I only had 2 page elements to fade out, fade in and out of one another, I can maybe find a way to live with it, but as we said in the beginning, we've got to fade in and out 4 page elements. So this little delay hack, which I just applied to LM1, I've got to apply to all the other subsequent elements. So how would I do that? Well, it looks like for every element that I add after the first one, I have to delay it and then delay it in some increment of 3,000 milliseconds. So I'll just add a delay here. I'll increase its time by an increment of 3,000 milliseconds. So that's 6,000 milliseconds. And then for LM3, I'll do the exact same thing, add a delay in an increment of 3,000 milliseconds. So after 6,000, that's 9,000 milliseconds. Also, I want to point something out. The last element here, LM3, which is referring to this bad boy here, I don't want that one to fade out. I want that one to, when it fades in, I want it to stay. Animations like this are a very common request, I find, among clients. So let's see what happens. All the elements should fade in and out of one another in sync, and the last element should not fade out. Is that what I get? So far, so good. And the last one should come in, and it should not fade out. Great, perfect. Well, 2 things. One, like I said, figuring out these delays, it's a bit of the pain in the butt. Also, it's prone to errors. Things like this, when you have to figure out all these calculations, I find are very error prone. And 2, we're not adhering to the dry principle, which we discussed at the top of this video. So a for loop is really going to help us adhere to that principle. So let's start creating our for loop. And our for loop is going to dynamically create this code for us. Something I want to point out real quick. Just note that the first element that we're fading in, it's got a fade in, a delay, and a fade out. The last element has just a delay and the fade in, and any other element in between the first and last one, it's got a delay, a fade in, yet another delay, and a fade out. We have to write our for loop to be able to differentiate when to apply which line of jQuery to which page element. And we're going to write our for loop to do exactly that. So let's get started now. In the interest of time, I skipped ahead in the video and changed our code a little bit. I kept the code we just created. I just commented out here because I'm definitely going to be referring to it as our tutorial progresses. But what I did up here was I kept the self-invoking jQuery function, but I created a bunch of variables. Variables are containers of data to be used at some point in your code, and our for loop in one way or another is going to be using all of these variables. So the first variable I created is a variable called your fade, and I set it equal to 1. And this is equal to the amount of time in seconds that the elements will fade in and fade out. The next variable I created was your delay, and that's equal to the amount of times, one extra space there, it's equal to the amount of time in seconds that there will be a delay between each fade in and each fade out. Now I did all of this stuff in seconds, but when we were writing out our code by hand, everything was done in milliseconds. And doing things in milliseconds is the right way because in this instance, that's how computers are counting time. So if I want to use seconds up here, I've got to convert them to milliseconds, and I can do that using some basic third grade math. So I created a variable called fade time, and it's equal to whatever the value of your fade is, which in this case is 1, and then it's multiplied by 1,000, so it stands to reason that the value of your fade is 1,000 milliseconds. Yeah, by the way, just note these comments I put by each variable. I just put them here so as we're going along, you can, in case you need to refer to exactly what these variables are doing, pause the video, look at the comments, and you'll know. So that I did my second to millisecond conversion for the fade time. I now have to do it for the delay time. And here's a variable called delay time, and that's equal to whatever the value of your delay is, which in this case is 2, and then you multiply it by 1,000, so it stands to reason that the value of delay time is 2,000 milliseconds. We're doing this because we're assuming that we're working in a team environment and we're going to pass this code on to somebody else. It's easier for that somebody else to think in seconds instead of milliseconds. So when we give them our code, we say, hey man, all you've got to do to make it work is just think in seconds. My code will do the heavy lifting for you and convert things in milliseconds. It's a very good habit to have if you're a web developer in a team environment. So those are those variables. When we were writing out our code by hand, we had to do that crazy hack where we had to delay stuff in some increment of 3,000, and we still have to do that. And if you recall, we got that increment of 3,000 by adding the first element's fade in time to its delay time. So we're going to do that again here. We create a new variable called total time, and we're taking whatever the value of fade time is, and we just said that was 1,000. We're adding it to whatever the value of delay time is, which we just said was 2,000. And it stands to reason then that total time is equal to 3,000. This next variable, all LMs, equals toBeFaded.length. What this variable is doing is it's using jQuery to find all of the page elements of the toBeFaded class, and this .length at the end will tell us exactly how many there are. So in that case, we see that there are 4 page elements of the toBeFaded class, so it stands to reason that all LMs equals 4. This last variable, LMNoFade, it's going to help our for loop detect which is the last page element on our web page. This one here, this one right there. We're doing this because, as we said a few minutes ago, the very last page element only gets a delay and a fade in. And our for loop needs to be able to detect what the last page element is so it can create the proper jQuery for it. This LMNoFade variable is going to help us. So LMNoFade is equal to whatever the value of all LMs is, which we just said was 4, and it's going to subtract 1 from it. So it stands to reason that the value of LMNoFade is equal to 3. Again, LMNoFade, its value is going to help us detect the last page element that we want to fade in a certain way. LMNoFade equals 3. This 3 just happens to match this 3 here of the last page element. That's definitely not a coincidence. Alright, so we've created all of our variables to be used inside of our for loop, or access from our for loop. Now let's actually create the actual for loop. So let's do it.